Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Tonight, we're meeting a ruler who commanded armies, and yet spent his nights correcting his own thoughts. Not rewriting laws, not issuing threats, not dreaming of monuments, just quietly arguing with himself on paper. His name was Marcus Aurelius, born in 121 AD, ruling from 161 to 180, and remembered as Rome's most famous Stoic emperor. And even before we get into wars, plagues, and politics, I want you to hold one idea in your mind, gently, like a candle that doesn't flicker. Marcus didn't chase power. Power found him. That sounds like a simple line, but it explains almost everything about him. Because the Roman Empire in the 2nd century didn't need just any ruler. It needed a person who could carry a huge, complicated machine, an empire stretching across continents, without turning that machine into a weapon against its own people. And Marcus tried. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but he tried in a way that still feels strangely familiar, especially if you've ever carried responsibility that felt too heavy for your actual life. Now, quick pause. If you're returning, it's good to have you back. And if you're new, welcome. Settle in. This is not a loud channel. This is a slow channel. The kind where history doesn't shout. It leans closer and speaks calmly. And in the comments, tell me this, whenever you feel like it. Do you think a philosopher can survive political power without being changed by it? Not in theory, in real life. Because that is the tension Marcus lived inside every day. When Marcus becomes emperor in 161 AD, Rome is still wearing the expensive perfume of stability, what later writers call the Pax Romana, a long stretch of relative order. But it's important not to romanticize it too much. Even in good times, Rome is not peaceful in the way modern people imagine peace. There are border pressures, power struggles under polite language, and provinces that require constant management. The empire isn't fragile like glass, but it is strained like a rope that is always being pulled. And what makes Marcus interesting is that he seems to sense this strain, even when Rome is still pretending everything is fine. He inherits a world that looks stable, and learns, slowly, that it's stable the way a calm sea is stable right before weather turns. He rules at the height of Roman power. Yet many scholars also treat his death as a symbolic line marking the fading of that long stability. And the unsettling part? Marcus doesn't fall because he is cruel. He doesn't fall because he is foolish. He struggles because the world he inherits is changing, politically, militarily, and even biologically, through disease. So when people call him a philosopher king, it's not just praise, it's also a question. What happens when wisdom is asked to do the work of brute force? Marcus is famous today largely because of Meditations, and here's something that matters right away. Meditations was not written for us. It wasn't crafted for an audience, polished for reputation, or designed as a legacy project. It's closer to a private notebook, written as personal training, like mental exercises, repeated, refined, and sometimes messy. Many entries were likely written while he was on campaign, in the cold tension of military life around the early to mid-170s. So when you read Marcus, you're not reading a public speech. You're reading what he says to himself when no one is watching. And that alone separates him from most rulers in history, because most rulers want to be remembered. Marcus, oddly, seems more concerned with being worthy, and those are not the same thing. He writes in Greek, the language of philosophy and educated culture across the empire, even though Latin is the language of Roman power. That choice tells you something. Even as emperor, he is still speaking to the part of himself that wants to be a student. And that's why he feels modern, because modern life is also full of people who have titles and responsibilities, and yet privately feel like they're learning as they go, trying not to become worse versions of themselves. Marcus is, in many ways, the patron saint of that feeling. Now, Marcus doesn't rule alone at first. One of the most important political decisions of his early reign is also one of the strangest. He refuses to rule unless Lucius Verus is given equal authority as co-emperor. This creates one of the first major examples of formal co-rule at the top. On paper, they are equals. In practice, Marcus is seen as the senior figure, the steadier mind, the more serious presence, while Lucius is sent to handle the Parthian War, partly because he's considered more physically suited to military command. That early choice already reveals Marcus's style. He doesn't hoard power just because he can. He treats power like something dangerous, something to be shared, structured, and restrained. That is not typical for emperors, and it is not even typical for people. But here is the part where the philosopher-emperor idea gets tested by reality. Because the moment Marcus takes power, crisis begins to gather. Rome fights in the east against the Parthian Empire, and although the campaigns have successes, they also carry moral shadows, cities taken, populations harmed, and a sense that victory can come at a cost that doesn't feel clean. And then, the returning armies are associated, at least by many historians, with the arrival and spread of the Antonine Plague, a catastrophic outbreak that contributed to major depopulation and fear across the empire. The exact disease remains debated, but smallpox is often treated as a leading possibility in scholarly discussion. So Marcus is not simply a wise man ruling a golden era. He is a tired man ruling the end of an era, while the world starts demanding emergency decisions. And in the north, pressure builds along the Danube frontier. Tribes move, alliances shift, migration pressure rises, and the empire begins to feel the pull of many peoples on its borders. This leads into the long, grinding frontier conflicts we call the Marcomannic Wars, which later sources link to invasions that even penetrated toward Italy. So here is the truth that sits underneath the romance. Marcus's reign is a series of burdens: war in the east, pressure in the north, disease inside the cities, fear in the countryside, economic strain, administrative exhaustion, and through all of it, he's trying to do something rare. He's trying to keep his mind from becoming ugly. That is what Stoicism means for him. Not a motivational poster, not a trendy quote. A discipline, a daily practice of not letting stress turn him into a monster. And when you read his private notes, you can feel the effort. Not the pose, the effort. Now, let's return to that opening image. The emperor correcting his own thoughts at night. That's not poetic decoration. That's his real life. Because Marcus is not writing meditations in a library with warm lamps and soft music. He is writing in an empire that is cracking under strain. And his goal is not to feel calm for its own sake. His goal is to be useful, to make decisions without panic, to avoid cruelty as a shortcut, to stay disciplined when no one would blame him for becoming harsh. This is why he remains one of the most discussed rulers in history. Not because he was the greatest conqueror, not because he was the funniest or most charismatic, but because he makes a promise, quietly, repeatedly, to be decent inside a system that rewards ruthlessness. And that leads us to the question that will guide the whole story. Can philosophy survive power? Or does power always win in the end, even against a thoughtful mind? Because by the end of Marcus's reign, the empire will not look the same. And the person who follows him will become a warning sign for history. But we're not there yet. For now, we need to go back to the beginning, before the crown, before the war camps, before the notebook in Greek. Back to a boy born into privilege, shaped early by loss, raised inside Rome's elite world, where destiny could be assigned like a legal document. If you approve this tone and pacing, I'll write part 2, 1,000+ words, next, continuing seamlessly from here, and still using no extra headings beyond the one you already have at the top. Yes, so let's go back to the beginning. Not to the crown, not to the armies, not even to philosophy, but to a child who had no idea how carefully his life was being watched by history. Marcus Aurelius was born in April of 121 AD. In Rome itself, not on a distant frontier, not in a military camp, but at the heart of the empire. His full name at birth was Marcus Annius Verus, a name that already carried weight, lineage, and expectation. The Veri were not newcomers. They were an old senatorial family, respected, wealthy, and deeply embedded in Roman elite life. Their roots stretched back to Baetica, in modern southern Spain, a province known for producing influential Roman families. Over generations, the Anni had climbed steadily, not through scandal or spectacle, but through patience, alliances, and reliability. This matters, because Marcus did not grow up feeling hunted by ambition. He grew up surrounded by stability, and that shaped the kind of man he became. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, died when Marcus was still very young, probably around the age of 3. Marcus would later mention his father only briefly, but the way he does it is revealing. He credits him with qualities like modesty, restraint, and a kind of quiet strength. It's striking how little bitterness there is. No resentment, no dramatics, just acknowledgement. And that, already, sounds like Marcus. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, played a much larger role in his upbringing. She was wealthy even by aristocratic standards, owning extensive properties, including brickworks outside Rome, a serious source of income at a time when the city was constantly expanding and rebuilding. Rome needed bricks the way modern cities need steel. Lucilla was not just rich, she was disciplined, practical, and socially respected. Marcus grew up in comfort, but not indulgence. He lived on the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's more refined residential districts, surrounded by large villas rather than public crowds. Later in life, Marcus would refer to his childhood home with affection, remembering it as a place of order and calm. That sense of early structure stayed with him, even when his life became chaotic. He seemed to carry an inner memory of steadiness. After his father's death, Marcus spent much of his childhood under the care of his grandfather, Marcus Annius Verus the Elder, a former consul. From him, Marcus absorbed lessons that went beyond status: lessons about behavior, self-control, and how not to abuse authority. In his private reflections, Marcus thanks his grandfather for teaching him integrity and balance. He also hints, gently, at household tensions, including discomfort with his grandfather's companion after his grandmother's death. It's a small detail, but an important one. Marcus never pretends his life was perfect. He just refuses to dramatize it. As a boy, Marcus was not immediately drawn to books and philosophy. In fact, early accounts describe him as physically active. He trained in wrestling and boxing, and he took part in ceremonial religious duties as a member of the Salii, a priestly group associated with Mars, the god of war. That combination, ritual discipline and physical training, was typical for elite Roman boys. Rome expected its future leaders to be capable in body as well as mind. Marcus fit that expectation easily. His education followed the standard aristocratic path: private tutors, long hours of instruction, and exposure to both Greek and Latin culture. Greek mattered enormously. It was the language of philosophy, science, and refined thought across the eastern half of the empire. One of his early teachers, Diognetus, was not a philosopher in the strict sense, but an artist and intellectual who encouraged Marcus toward simplicity. Under his influence, Marcus experimented with living plainly, wearing rough clothing, sleeping on the floor, and avoiding unnecessary comforts. This phase didn't last forever. His mother eventually insisted he return to a normal bed, but the impulse itself mattered. It showed that Marcus was already testing himself, not to impress others, but to see what he could live without. By his early teens, Marcus's education intensified. He studied literature, rhetoric, and language under respected teachers, including scholars who emphasized clarity, precision, and restraint. One of them, Alexander of Cotiaeum, helped shape Marcus's writing style: careful, direct, and free of unnecessary ornament. That style would later define meditations: clear thoughts, short reminders, no performance. And then, just as Marcus was settling into the predictable path of a young Roman noble, history interfered. In the mid-130s, Emperor Hadrian began to decline. His health worsened, and Rome once again faced the question it always dreaded: succession. Hadrian's first chosen heir died suddenly. The Senate hesitated. The empire waited. Eventually, Hadrian selected Antoninus Pius, a respected and steady figure, but with conditions. Antoninus had to adopt two young men in return, Marcus and Lucius, linking the future of the empire to a carefully engineered family structure. When Marcus learned of this adoption, ancient sources tell us something unusual. He was not thrilled. He was subdued, even saddened. He had to leave his mother's home on the Caelian Hill and move into Hadrian's residence. Not as a guest, but as a political asset. His life, until then shaped by routine and study, suddenly became public property. This moment marks a turning point. Marcus could no longer imagine a quiet senatorial career, rising slowly through offices, perhaps serving as a provincial administrator, maybe commanding troops one day. Instead, his future narrowed sharply. Everything led upward, and Marcus felt the weight of that narrowing. The Senate soon granted him special exemptions from age requirements, allowing him to begin public service earlier than usual. On paper, this looked like honor. In reality, it was acceleration. And Marcus responded the only way he knew how, by becoming more disciplined, not more confident. Ancient biographers note that even as his status changed, his behavior did not. He remained respectful, modest, and careful with speech. He did not suddenly adopt arrogance or extravagance. That steadiness would later be praised as virtue. But at the time, it likely felt like pressure. Because once Rome decides you matter, it does not let go easily. By the time Marcus reached his late teens, he was already being watched as a future ruler. His words were noted, his behavior interpreted, his education refined for leadership rather than curiosity. And yet, he did not resist this fate dramatically. He did not rebel, he absorbed it. That too is part of his character. Marcus does not fight destiny head-on. He tries to meet it without losing himself. And that approach, quiet, inward, restrained, would soon be tested far beyond the safe walls of aristocratic Rome. Because the next phase of his life would force him to answer a question he never asked for. What happens when philosophy is no longer an interest, but a necessity? Because destiny, in Rome, never waits for comfort. By the time Marcus reached his late teens, the empire had already begun rearranging his life around a future he hadn't requested. And the force driving that rearrangement was not ambition or talent, but succession anxiety, one of Rome's oldest fears. Emperor Hadrian was failing. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, visibly, and in a way that unsettled everyone who understood how fragile imperial continuity really was. Rome did not collapse when emperors died. It collapsed when no one agreed on who should come next. Hadrian knew this better than most. He had spent years stabilizing borders, consolidating power, and trying to give the empire a sense of permanence. But permanence in Rome depended on one thing above all else: an orderly transfer of authority. At first, Hadrian chose Lucius Aelius Caesar as his heir. The decision was controversial, and fate quickly intervened. Lucius Aelius died suddenly in 138 AD, the night before he was due to address the Senate. The empire held its breath again. And this is where Marcus's life bends sharply. Hadrian turned to Antoninus Pius, a man known less for brilliance than for steadiness. But Hadrian did not trust chance. He trusted structure, so he imposed a condition. Antoninus would be adopted as emperor only if he, in turn, adopted two young men, Marcus Annius Verus and Lucius, Soges an Buscur Bisas, the son of the late Aelius. In one legal motion, Marcus was no longer simply a promising aristocrat. He became a hinge in Rome's future. And when Marcus received this news, ancient sources record something unexpected. He did not celebrate. He did not boast. He did not rush to embrace his destiny. He reacted with quiet sadness. That reaction tells us a great deal. Marcus understood what adoption into the imperial family meant. It wasn't affection. It wasn't honor. It was obligation, surveillance, and lifelong exposure. His private life would now be public. His mistakes would be political. His character would be judged not as a man, but as a symbol. He left his mother's home on the Caelian Hill and moved into Hadrian's residence, not because he wanted to, but because the role required it. And from that moment forward, Marcus belonged less to himself. The Senate, eager to secure stability, began accelerating his political path. Laws that restricted young men from holding office before certain ages were quietly adjusted in his favor. Marcus was allowed to serve as quaestor earlier than tradition permitted. To outsiders, this looked like privilege. To Marcus, it likely felt like compression. His life, once spacious and gradual, now moved in narrow corridors. Every step mattered, every word was noted, every silence interpreted. And yet, Marcus did not resist this pressure with bitterness. Instead, he began doing something subtle but crucial. He turned inward. This is where Stoicism begins to matter, not as a school of thought, but as a survival tool. Stoic philosophy taught that fate cannot be controlled, only responded to. That resistance to inevitability wastes energy. That dignity comes from choosing how one carries what must be carried. Marcus did not cheer his fate, but he accepted it. And acceptance, in Stoic terms, was not surrender, it was clarity. Around this time, Antoninus Pius formally adopted Marcus, and his name changed accordingly. Roman names were not personal labels, they were maps of political identity. Marcus's evolving name signaled his movement from private citizen to public future. Still, despite these transformations, sources emphasize something consistent. Marcus did not change in character. He remained careful with money, reserved in behavior, respectful toward relatives and elders. He did not weaponize his new status. This consistency would later earn him admiration. But at the time, it likely went unnoticed, because Rome valued certainty more than virtue. In 138 AD, Hadrian died, and Antoninus Pius assumed power. The transition was smooth, which was exactly the point. Antoninus ruled for more than 2 decades, offering the empire a long stretch of calm administration. And Marcus watched. He learned, not from lectures alone, but from proximity. He saw how Antoninus governed without spectacle, how decisions were made quietly, how law mattered more than personality, how patience could be a form of strength. But even as Antoninus ruled, Marcus was not free from expectation. He was being shaped deliberately, positioned, trained, and prepared for a future that felt less like opportunity and more like inheritance of duty. This is where the Stoic idea of fate without enthusiasm comes into focus. Marcus did not romanticize destiny. He didn't dress it up as divine favor. He saw it as a role assigned, like a watch duty that cannot be refused. And that mindset would define him. Because Marcus never treats power as something he deserves. He treats it as something that has happened. That distinction is rare. Most rulers justify their authority by claiming destiny chose them. Marcus just acknowledges that destiny arrived. This period of his life, between adoption and eventual rule, is often overlooked in popular stories. But it's essential. It explains why Marcus never governs like a man intoxicated by command. He had years to sit with the idea of authority before touching it. Years to question it. Years to fear it. Years to decide what kind of person he would be if it ever became unavoidable. And during these years, his education shifted. Not away from rhetoric or law, but toward restraint, toward clarity, toward moral discipline. Marcus's teachers during this time included men who represented different values. Some prized eloquence, others prized philosophical rigor. One, in particular, Quintus Junius Rusticus, would become especially influential. Rusticus did not encourage performance, he discouraged vanity. He pushed Marcus away from ornamental language and toward plain thought. Away from impressing others and toward correcting oneself. That influence mattered, because when Marcus later wrote reminders to himself about patience, impermanence, and humility, He wasn't imitating a style, he was continuing a training. And all of this unfolded before Marcus ever wore the imperial purple. By the time he approached adulthood, Marcus had already learned a lesson many rulers never do. Power is not something you rise into, it's something that closes around you. And how you prepare for that moment, quietly, privately, without applause, determines everything that follows. Because soon enough, the long calm of Antoninus's reign would end. And Marcus would discover whether acceptance was enough. When fate stopped being abstract and became painfully real. Because preparation alone is never enough. What matters is how you prepare. And this is where Marcus's story becomes quietly unusual. As Antoninus Pius settled into a long, calm reign, Marcus entered the phase of life where many young elites in Rome either hardened into ambition or softened into comfort. Marcus did neither. Instead, he found himself pulled between two powerful currents of Roman elite culture, rhetoric and philosophy, each offering a different version of what leadership should look like. On one side stood eloquence, reputation, and public performance. On the other stood restraint, discipline, and inner order. Rome admired the first. Marcus slowly chose the second. His education during this period placed him under the guidance of some of the most respected intellectual figures of the age. Among them were Marcus Cornelius Fronto, the greatest Latin orator of his time, and Herodes Atticus, a wealthy Greek sophist whose influence stretched across the Eastern Empire. Fronto believed deeply in the power of language. To him, leadership meant clarity of expression, persuasive force, and mastery over words. He trained Marcus to speak carefully, to choose words precisely, and to understand how rhetoric could move both Senate and people. And Marcus respected him. Their surviving correspondence shows warmth, affection, even tenderness. Fronto worried about Marcus's health, encouraged him to rest, and treated him not just as a student, but as someone he genuinely cared about. Yet Fronto also disliked philosophy. Not entirely, but he distrusted it. He feared that philosophical discussion could become empty, abstract, and morally theatrical. To Fronto, too many philosophers spoke beautifully about virtue without practicing it. He worried that Marcus might lose himself in ideas rather than action. On the other side stood Herodes Atticus, an immensely wealthy Greek intellectual, admired by many and resented by others. He represented the grandeur of Greek culture, the speeches, the performance, the authority that came from sounding impressive. But Herodes was not a Stoic. He mocked Stoic restraint, dismissing emotional control as weakness and simplicity as affectation. His world was one of display, not reduction. Marcus observed all of this carefully. And then there was a third figure, quieter, less theatrical, but far more influential. Quintus Junius Rusticus. Rusticus was older than Marcus, more severe, and deeply shaped by Stoic tradition. His grandfather had suffered under tyranny, and that legacy mattered. Rusticus did not teach philosophy as an academic exercise. He taught it as moral discipline. Under Rusticus's influence, Marcus learned to distrust ornamented speech, to avoid unnecessary cleverness, to strip language down until only what mattered remained. Rusticus urged him to stop reading speeches written for applause and start reading texts written for correction. He discouraged poetry, drama, and rhetorical excess, not because they were evil, but but because they distracted from clarity. Marcus later credits Rusticus for steering him away from empty eloquence and toward a form of thinking that was practical, demanding, and uncomfortable. This mattered deeply, because Marcus was not being trained to win debates. He was being trained to endure responsibility, and endurance requires simplicity. During this period, Marcus began forming the habit that would later define meditations: writing to himself, not for others. Short reminders, direct instructions, self-criticism without self-pity. He warned himself not to become attached to titles, not to be intoxicated by honor, not to let proximity to power change his behavior. One of his most revealing personal cautions emerges from this mindset: do not become dyed purple. Purple, in Rome, was not just a color. It was a substance produced through costly, violent labor, reserved for emperors and gods. To be dyed purple was to be absorbed into power so completely that it stained your identity. Marcus feared that. Not rebellion, not assassination, corruption of character. And this fear was not abstract. Antoninus insisted that Marcus move into the imperial residence on the Palatine Hill, adopt court customs, and accept ceremonial visibility. Marcus resisted inwardly, but complied outwardly. This tension between compliance and conscience would follow him for life. He did not reject the palace. He tried to live virtuously inside it. That is much harder. During these years, Marcus also struggled physically. He was never particularly robust. Letters mention chest pains, fatigue, and ongoing health issues. Fronto urged him repeatedly to rest, to reduce strain, to take care of himself. Marcus listened, but only partially. He often pushed himself too hard, studying late, working excessively, and refusing to step back from obligations. Later writers suggest that his commitment to discipline may have harmed his health as much as it strengthened his character. This is another quiet truth about Marcus. His virtues were not effortless. They cost him. And yet, despite physical strain and inner tension, Marcus continued to mature into a figure of restraint rather than ambition. He served as consul for the first time in 140 AD, alongside Antoninus Pius. The position was prestigious, but Marcus did not treat it as a triumph. He treated it as rehearsal. He watched Antoninus closely, how he handled petitions, how he listened, how he avoided spectacle. Antoninus ruled without drama, without cruelty, and without obsession over legacy. Marcus absorbed that lesson deeply. The Roman court during this time was full of people who sought favor, advancement, and influence. Marcus learned to navigate this environment without becoming consumed by it. He maintained respectful distance. He avoided flattery. He did not cultivate a cult of personality. This restraint was noticed, but it was also misunderstood. Some saw it as weakness, others as lack of passion. Marcus did not correct them. Because Stoicism did not teach him to manage perceptions, it taught him to manage himself. This phase of his life, often overshadowed by later wars, was the real forge of his character. It was where he learned that leadership does not begin with command. It begins with self-governance. And that lesson would soon be tested in ways no tutor could simulate. Because when Antoninus Pius finally died, Marcus would no longer be learning beside power. He would be inside it. And philosophy would stop being preparation and start being necessity, because sooner or later, preparation runs out. and what remains is only habit. By the time Marcus began writing what we now call meditations, he was no longer a student experimenting with ideas. He was a man under pressure, surrounded by responsibility, illness, death, and expectation. And this matters because meditations is not philosophy written from comfort. It is philosophy written from fatigue. Marcus did not sit down and decide to write a book. There was no plan, no structure, no audience in mind. What he wrote were reminders, short notes meant to steady himself, to correct his thinking when it drifted, to bring himself back to a moral center when the world around him felt chaotic. That alone explains why the tone feels so different from most ancient texts. There is no persuasion here, no attempt to convince, no display of learning, just a man talking to himself. And perhaps that is why the words survived. Marcus wrote these notes in Greek, not Latin. That choice is often misunderstood. Latin was the language of law, command, and Roman identity. Greek was the language of philosophy, reflection, and inner life across much of the empire. Greek was where Marcus thought most clearly. Writing in Greek allowed him to step away from the voice of authority and into the voice of discipline. It was not the language of issuing orders. It was the language of asking himself hard questions. The entries themselves are uneven. Some are gentle reminders. Others are sharp rebukes. He scolds himself for impatience, for vanity, for letting irritation creep in. He reminds himself that other people are not obstacles, but fellow participants in the same flawed human condition. And over again, he returns to a few central ideas. That everything passes. That reputation fades. That power dissolves. That only character remains. What's striking is how often Marcus seems to be talking himself down from emotional reactions rather than celebrating virtue. He doesn't say, "I am wise." He says, "Do not become angry. Do not seek praise. Do not forget how small you are." This is not confidence. This is vigilance. And it tells us something important about Marcus's psychology. He did not trust himself to remain good automatically. He believed goodness required constant effort. The Stoic tradition Marcus inherited was not about suppressing emotion entirely. It was about training response, about noticing impulses and choosing not to follow them blindly. Marcus understood that anger, fear, pride, and despair would arise, especially in someone with power. His goal was not to erase these feelings, but to prevent them from ruling him. That's why meditations feel so practical. He reminds himself that people act poorly out of ignorance, not malice. That losing one's temper does not correct injustice. That death is not an insult, but a natural event. These are not abstract ideas. They are tools. And many of them were likely written during military campaigns far from Rome, surrounded by soldiers, messengers, and constant uncertainty. There are references to cold mornings, to exhaustion, to the irritation of daily duties that never end. Marcus is not reflecting on Stoicism as an academic exercise. He is using it to get through the day. One of the most revealing aspects of meditations is what Marcus doesn't talk about. He rarely mentions specific victories. He does not list achievements. He almost never names enemies. There is no self-justification. And perhaps most notably, he says nothing about Commodus, the son who would inherit the empire and later become infamous. This silence has puzzled historians. But psychologically, it makes sense. Meditations is not where Marcus processed political strategy. It is where he processed himself. He wasn't interested in documenting events. He was interested in correcting reactions. And that brings us to why this text still resonates so strongly today. Modern readers recognize something in Marcus that feels familiar: the sense of being overwhelmed. The attempt to act decently in systems that reward shortcuts. The fear of becoming someone you don't respect simply because circumstances push you there. Marcus speaks to that, not by offering solutions, but by offering companionship. He never claims mastery. He never declares himself finished. Even near the end of his life, he writes like a student, reminding himself to keep learning. There is a famous anecdote from later sources that captures this attitude perfectly. An emperor, already old, on his way to study with a philosopher, is questioned about where he's going. His answer is simple: it is good, even now, to learn what one does not yet know. Whether the story is embellished or not, it aligns completely with the Marcus we meet in his writing, a man who never assumed he had arrived. This humility, however, was not universally admired in his own time. Roman culture valued strength, decisiveness, and visible authority. Marcus's inwardness could be misread as softness. But Marcus was not soft. He was restrained, and restraint is much harder to sustain than dominance. What makes Meditations remarkable is not that it presents a perfect philosophy. It doesn't. It presents a process of checking one's thoughts, of adjusting perspective, of reminding oneself that power does not excuse cruelty and suffering does not excuse moral collapse. Marcus understood that he could not control the empire fully. Borders would break, plagues would spread, people would disappoint him. The only domain he believed he could truly govern was his own mind. And so, he focused there. That focus did not make his reign easy, but it made it coherent. It gave him a center. And that center would be tested almost immediately when the calm administration of Antoninus Pius ended, and Marcus was forced to step fully into power, not as a student, not as an observer, but as the one responsible for holding Rome together. That moment would arrive in 161 AD, and with it, philosophy would stop being private discipline and become public burden. Because there comes a moment when thought must give way to action. And for Marcus, that moment arrived quietly, without drama, without ceremony, without relief. In 161 AD, Emperor Antoninus Pius died after more than 2 decades of steady, unremarkable rule. Rome did not shake. There were no riots, no civil wars, no desperate scrambling for legitimacy. That was Antoninus's final gift to the empire, a smooth transition. And suddenly, Marcus was no longer preparing for power. He was standing inside it. The Senate moved quickly, as it always did when stability was at stake. Marcus was offered the full imperial authority, titles, honors, religious supremacy, command of the legions. All of it was his by right of adoption and preparation. And Marcus hesitated, not theatrically, not in a way designed to impress, but genuinely. Ancient sources tell us that Marcus did not want to rule alone. He insisted, firmly, that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, be granted equal authority. Only then would he accept the position. This was an extraordinary decision. Rome had known co-rule in limited, informal ways, but never a formal, legal sharing of the highest authority between 2 emperors. The Senate resisted at first. Shared power made them uneasy. It blurred lines. It introduced uncertainty. Marcus did not back down. He understood something that many rulers ignore: Authority accepted unwillingly often fractures later. Authority structured carefully can endure. Eventually, the Senate agreed, and so Rome gained its first official co-emperorship, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, equal in title, unequal in temperament. On paper, they shared power. In reality, Rome understood immediately who stood at the center. Marcus had served as consul multiple times. He had worked alongside Antoninus for years. He held the role of Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of Rome. He had the trust of administrators, jurists, and senators. Lucius, by contrast, was younger in experience, more inclined toward pleasure, spectacle, and physical pursuits. He enjoyed games, hunting, the circus, and social life in ways Marcus never did. This difference would shape their partnership. But at the beginning, Marcus worked carefully to preserve harmony. The first public act of the new emperors was to address the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers responsible for imperial security. Here, tradition demanded generosity. Loyalty had to be secured. The donative offered was enormous, far larger than previous emperors had given. This was not extravagance. It was insurance. Marcus understood that philosophy alone could not stabilize an empire. Institutions required material reassurance. Soldiers needed to feel valued, not merely instructed. And yet, even here, Marcus showed restraint. The generosity was calculated, not indulgent. He was buying time, not favor. Publicly, the response was positive. The people of Rome admired the new emperor's calm demeanor. There was openness in court. Even satirists and playwrights were allowed to mock them lightly, something unheard of under harsher rulers. Marcus did not take offense. He did not silence criticism. That tolerance earned him goodwill, especially among the Senate. But beneath the surface calm, Marcus already sensed what was coming. Because an emperor does not inherit peace, he inherits unfinished problems. Almost immediately, pressures emerged along Rome's borders. In the east, tensions with the Parthian Empire flared into open conflict. In the north, movements among Germanic tribes hinted at instability along the Danube. Marcus made a crucial decision early in his reign. Lucius Verus would lead the Eastern Front campaign. This choice was practical. Lucius was physically robust, less tied to Rome's daily administration, and eager for visible command. Marcus, by contrast, was needed in the capital to oversee law, logistics, governance, and public order. The arrangement made sense, but it also revealed Marcus's leadership style. He delegated force. He retained responsibility. Lucius departed for the east, eventually settling in Antioch, while Marcus remained in Rome. And here, Marcus's life took on a new rhythm, one defined not by grand gestures, but by relentless routine. He reviewed petitions, settled disputes, oversaw legal reforms, managed finances, responded to crises, day after day. This was not the glamorous side of empire. This was the grinding center, and Marcus threw himself into it. He spent long hours in legal sessions, listening carefully, weighing evidence, consulting advisors. He treated justice not as spectacle, but as obligation. This earned him a reputation among later jurists as one of Rome's most legally competent emperors. He was meticulous, cautious, and deeply concerned with fairness, especially toward vulnerable groups. He showed particular interest in laws concerning slaves, orphans, and guardianship, areas often neglected by rulers focused on conquest. And still, he struggled. Letters and accounts suggest that Marcus's health continued to trouble him. Fatigue, pain, and exhaustion were constant companions. Yet he refused to step back. This refusal was not arrogance, it was Stoic duty. Marcus believed that one does not choose responsibility based on comfort. One chooses it based on necessity. And necessity was everywhere. In 161 or 162, disaster struck closer to home. The Tiber River flooded, submerging parts of Rome, destroying livestock, and triggering food shortages. Marcus and Lucius responded immediately, ordering grain distributions and relief measures. Marcus did not dramatize the response. He managed it. But this crisis foreshadowed something worse. Because soon, news began arriving from the east. Not just of military success, but of sickness. Soldiers returning from Parthian campaigns carried with them an unseen enemy. The empire would later know it as the Antonine Plague. At first, it was just rumor. Then reports, then panic. Marcus, still early in his reign, found himself governing an empire under biological assault. And here, philosophy faced its most severe test. Stoicism teaches acceptance of what cannot be controlled, but acceptance does not mean passivity. Marcus authorized relief efforts, adjusted financial priorities, and eventually sold imperial treasures to fund military and civil needs. He did not hoard wealth, he redistributed it. This decision shocked many. An emperor selling palace assets to support the state was rare, but Marcus saw no contradiction. Luxury meant nothing if the empire collapsed. As Lucius continued campaigns in the east, sometimes criticized for indulgence, sometimes praised for victory, Marcus bore the weight of continuity. He maintained order. He absorbed blame. He stabilized institutions. And through it all, he wrote, not proclamations, notes to himself, reminders to remain calm, to resist bitterness, to remember that suffering does not excuse cruelty. The contrast between Marcus and Lucius became increasingly clear. Where Lucius sought relief in pleasure, Marcus sought discipline. Where Lucius escaped pressure, Marcus absorbed it. When Lucius eventually returned to Italy, the empire had changed, and so had Marcus. He was no longer simply a philosopher with power. He was a ruler shaped by crisis. The partnership would not last much longer. But before that ending arrived, Marcus would be forced to confront the truth that no amount of wisdom can prevent suffering, only shape how one responds to it. And soon, the pressure on Rome's northern frontiers would demand something Marcus had long avoided: direct command, life on the edge of empire, cold camps, restless tribes, years away from Rome. That is where the story moves next. The frontier does not announce itself politely. It arrives as pressure, slow at first, then constant, then impossible to ignore. By the mid-160s, while Rome still told itself that peace reigned, the borders were already shifting. Movements were happening far beyond the marble halls of the capital. Entire peoples were on the move. Not armies alone, but families, wagons, livestock, memories. Migration disguised as invasion. Desperation mistaken for hostility. And Marcus Aurelius could no longer remain in Rome. The Eastern War against Parthia, led in name by Lucius Verus, had ended in victory. Armenia was reclaimed. Roman banners flew over Mesopotamian cities. The Senate celebrated triumphs, coins were struck, titles were awarded. But victory came at a price. Roman forces had pushed deep into Parthian territory, and in the process, cities like Seleucia were burned and pillaged. Ancient sources attempt to soften the story, claiming betrayal by the inhabitants, framing destruction as necessity, but the reality remains uncomfortable. Marcus never celebrated these acts in his writing. There are no triumphant reflections, no satisfaction, only silence. That silence matters, because at the same time, Rome's northern frontier began to unravel. Along the Danube, pressure had been building for years. Climate shifts, population movements from deeper in Eurasia, and the ripple effects of Roman expansion itself had destabilized the region. Tribes such as the Marcomanni, Quadi, and others were being pushed west and south by forces Rome barely understood. These were not simple raids, they were waves. In 166 AD, that wave broke. Germanic groups crossed the Danube in numbers large enough to overwhelm frontier defenses. Some reached as far as northern Italy, threatening cities that had not seen war for generations. For Romans raised on the belief that the empire's borders were permanent, this was a shock bordering on disbelief. The illusion of stability cracked. Marcus responded not with panic, but with presence. For the first time in his reign, he left Rome for extended periods and joined the legions on the frontier. The philosopher entered the cold camps. The emperor slept among soldiers. The ruler who once preferred books now lived among mud, frost, and constant uncertainty. This was not symbolic. Marcus stayed, year after year. The Marcomannic Wars were not a single campaign, but a grinding series of confrontations, negotiations, withdrawals, and returns. Some tribes were defeated militarily. Others were settled within Roman territory under strict conditions. Some alliances held, others collapsed. Marcus learned quickly that force alone would not resolve what was happening. These people were not simply enemies. They were displaced. So Marcus adapted. He authorized the settlement of certain groups inside imperial borders, assigning land, enforcing military service, and attempting integration rather than annihilation. This policy was controversial. Many senators feared dilution of Roman identity. Many generals doubted loyalty. Marcus understood the risk, but he also understood the alternative. Endless war. His Stoic training shaped these decisions. Nature, he believed, followed patterns larger than any state. Resistance without reason only prolonged suffering. Adaptation, guided by justice, offered survival. Still, adaptation came at a cost. The wars drained Rome's finances. Recruitment struggled as plague and casualties thinned the population. Marcus resorted again to selling imperial property, gold, statues, luxuries, to pay soldiers and maintain defenses. There was no glamour here, only endurance. During these years, Marcus wrote some of his most personal reflections, lines reminding himself not to resent those who caused harm, notes urging patience with difficult people, thoughts about impermanence written while surrounded by death. He was not writing as a victor. He was writing as a man trying not to harden. The contrast between philosophy and reality sharpened daily. Orders sent meant villages burned or spared. Delays meant lives lost. Mercy risked rebellion. Severity risked injustice. Marcus bore all of it, and he bore it largely alone. Lucius Verus did not share these northern hardships for long. In 169 AD, while returning from the Danube region, Lucius fell ill, likely from the same plague spreading through the empire, and died suddenly. Marcus was now sole ruler. No buffer, no shared burden, only responsibility. The death of Lucius ended Rome's first co-emperorship quietly, without drama. Marcus mourned him publicly and honored him fully, despite their differences. But privately, the weight doubled. From this point onward, Marcus would spend much of his remaining life on the frontier, far from Rome, far from comfort, ruling from tents and temporary headquarters, negotiating with tribal leaders one day and commanding legions the next. The empire he governed no longer felt eternal. It felt fragile. And perhaps for the first time, Marcus understood something deeply unsettling: that even the most disciplined mind cannot command history. It can only decide how to stand within it. The wars would continue, the pressure would not ease, and the greatest test of Marcus Aurelius was still unfolding, not in battle plans, but in how he would govern an empire stretched thin by war, disease, and fear. That test reaches its breaking point next, because when death itself begins to rule unchecked, philosophy must answer a question it can never escape. There are enemies you can see, armies gather, borders shift, messengers ride hard with warnings, and then there are enemies that arrive quietly, carried on breath, on skin, on the folds of a soldier's cloak. By the late 160s, the Roman Empire was fighting both. The Antonine Plague did not announce itself as a catastrophe. At first, it was dismissed as fatigue, as common sickness, as the price of campaigning far from home. Soldiers returning from the Eastern Wars brought stories of fever and rashes, of sudden weakness, of men collapsing without wounds. Then the reports multiplied. Cities began to empty. Modern scholars believe the disease was likely smallpox, based on descriptions by the physician Galen, who witnessed it firsthand. Fever, throat inflammation, skin eruptions. Death often followed within days. For an empire built on movement, troops, traders, administrators, this was devastating. The plague did not respect rank. It moved through legions, villages, ports, and palaces alike. Marcus Aurelius now ruled an empire where death was no longer episodic. It was constant. Estimates suggest that millions died over the following years. Entire regions lost a third or more of their population. Recruitment collapsed. Farms went untended. Tax revenues fell. Fear spread faster than any official decree. And Marcus did not hide. He did not flee Rome when the sickness reached the capital, nor did he abandon the frontier when outbreaks followed the armies north. He stayed. That decision mattered, because emperors were not expected to share danger. Marcus did. Relief measures were enacted quickly. Grain distributions expanded. Medical support, limited as it was by ancient knowledge, was encouraged. Burial practices were adjusted to cope with the scale of death. But no policy could stop the disease. So Marcus turned to what he could control: resources. To fund the military, relief, and administration during this collapse, Marcus made a choice that stunned the aristocracy. He ordered imperial treasures sold: gold plate, statues, court luxuries, even items associated with past emperors. These were symbols of continuity, and Marcus gave them up. This was not symbolic austerity, it was necessity. War continued along the Danube. Soldiers still needed pay, borders still needed defense, and now fewer hands were available to hold the line. The economy strained under the pressure. Inflation followed scarcity. Land changed hands. Labor shortages reshaped rural life. Marcus could not fix this. He could only prevent it from turning into chaos. This is where his Stoicism faced its harshest test. Stoic thought accepts that external events lie beyond control, but it also demands responsibility for one's response. Marcus did not treat the plague as divine punishment or moral failure, as many contemporaries did. There were no mass persecutions ordered, no scapegoats, no hysterical religious purges. That restraint matters, because fear often drives cruelty. Marcus worked to maintain legal order even as courts struggled to function. He issued edicts to protect property rights of the deceased, ensure guardianship for orphaned children, and prevent exploitation during the crisis. Justice did not pause for disaster. It adjusted. Yet privately, the toll was heavy. Marcus lost children during these years. He lost friends. He watched seasoned soldiers weaken. He watched confidence drain from institutions once thought unshakable. And still, he wrote, his notes during this period become sharper, more urgent. They return again and again to the same ideas: mortality, impermanence, the futility of resentment. Not as comfort, as discipline. He reminds himself that death comes to emperors as easily as to slaves, that grief is natural, but bitterness is optional, that one must continue to act justly even when the outcome feels meaningless. This was not optimism, it was endurance. For Marcus, the plague exposed a truth many rulers avoid. Power cannot shield against nature. No decree stops a virus. No army can conquer disease. The emperor was reduced to what he had always been beneath the titles: a human being choosing how to behave. And yet, even in this collapse, Marcus did not retreat inward completely. He continued to command campaigns, issue judgments, and negotiate with frontier peoples. The war did not stop because the empire was sick. History did not wait. The strain of simultaneous war and plague pushed Rome to its limits. Many historians mark this period as the beginning of long-term imperial decline, not sudden collapse, but irreversible weakening. Marcus may have sensed this. There is a quiet urgency in his reflections from these years, a sense that time was narrowing, that choices mattered not because they would save the empire, but because they defined his character. The plague would linger for years, and when it finally receded, it would leave Rome changed, poorer, thinner, less confident. But Marcus would still be standing, worn, older, more severe. because surviving disaster does not make a ruler triumphant. It makes them responsible for what remains. And what remained was an empire that now required something harder than survival. It required justice. That quieter labor, often overlooked, would become Marcus's next arena. When people imagine imperial power, they picture armies in motion, banners lifted against the sky, decisive moments carved into stone. But for Marcus Aurelius, power most often looked like this: a long line of petitioners, a stack of legal cases, arguments over inheritance, guardianship, debt, abuse, and neglect, day after day. While war raged on the frontiers and disease thinned the population, Marcus devoted enormous energy to something far less dramatic, but far more enduring: law. Not as spectacle, as labor. Marcus ruled during a time when emperors were absolute in practice, even if republican language survived in form. He could issue commands without explanation. He could ignore the Senate. He could decide cases arbitrarily. He chose not to. Ancient jurists later described Marcus as one of the most legally competent emperors Rome ever had. That reputation was not earned through sweeping reforms or theatrical decrees, but through consistency, through patience with detail, and a refusal to treat justice as inconvenience. He presided personally over legal cases whenever possible. He listened. He questioned. He delayed judgment when facts were unclear. This frustrated some officials who preferred speed over care. Marcus preferred care over applause. One area where his influence was especially notable concerned slaves. Roman law treated slaves as property, yet Marcus consistently pushed interpretations that restrained cruelty. Masters were increasingly held accountable for extreme abuse. The idea that authority came with responsibility rather than license was reinforced again and again. This was not abolition. It was restraint. And in Rome, restraint was radical. Marcus also showed deep concern for orphans and minors, a population that grew rapidly during the years of plague and war. He strengthened guardianship laws, imposed stricter oversight on trustees, and punished those who exploited vulnerable heirs. These were quiet decisions. No triumphs were celebrated for protecting a child's inheritance. But Marcus understood something essential. An empire is judged not by how it treats the powerful, but by how it manages the weak when no one is watching. Even in matters of public finance, Marcus chose transparency over convenience. Despite his authority, he routinely consulted the Senate on expenditures, especially during crises. This was unnecessary from a legal standpoint, but it mattered symbolically. By involving the Senate, Marcus reinforced the idea that imperial power was custodial, not personal, that the emperor served the state, not the other way around. Some historians argue that this deference weakened imperial authority. Marcus would likely have disagreed. For him, legitimacy mattered more than dominance. This approach extended even to punishment. Marcus was notably reluctant to impose the death penalty. He favored exile, fines, or corrective measures where possible. Not because he believed people were harmless, but because irreversible decisions demanded absolute necessity. That principle weighed heavily during times of unrest. Rebellions, conspiracies, and disobedience were treated with firmness, but rarely cruelty. Marcus resisted the temptation to rule through fear, even when fear might have been effective. This restraint required discipline, and it cost him politically. There were moments when advisors urged harsher measures, when generals argued for collective punishment, when senators demanded exemplary executions to restore order. Marcus listened, and often refused. This refusal did not come from naivety. Marcus knew that mercy could be misinterpreted as weakness. He had read the history. He knew how emperors fell, but he also knew something else. Fear corrodes the ruler first. In his private notes, Marcus repeatedly warns himself against anger and judgment, against the satisfaction of punishment, against the belief that authority justifies impulse. He reminds himself that every wrongdoer acts from ignorance or compulsion, that cruelty multiplies harm rather than containing it. That justice must aim at correction, not revenge. These were not abstract ideas. They guided daily decisions, and they became harder to sustain as the years passed. Because justice, when practiced consistently, creates expectations, and expectations are dangerous. As the empire stabilized unevenly after plague and war, attention turned to the future, to succession, to continuity, to the question Marcus had been avoiding for years. Who comes next? The law could protect orphans. It could restrain cruelty. It could preserve order during crisis. But law could not guarantee wisdom in a successor. And Marcus knew it. That knowledge weighed on him more heavily than any campaign or courtroom, because soon he would face the most consequential legal and moral decision of his life. Not about punishment, not about war, but about inheritance. And that decision, quiet, irreversible, would define how history judged everything that came before. Some decisions announce themselves loudly, others arrive quietly, and change everything. For Marcus Aurelius, the most consequential choice of his life did not take place on a battlefield or in a court of law. It unfolded slowly, over years, in moments of fatigue, fear, and responsibility. It was the question of succession. For nearly a century, Rome had been ruled by a remarkable sequence of emperors chosen not by blood, but by adoption. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, each selected a capable adult heir, trained them carefully, and passed power deliberately. This system worked. It insulated the empire from the accidents of birth. Marcus himself was a product of it. And yet, Marcus would end it. Not suddenly, not thoughtlessly, but decisively. He had sons. Most did not survive childhood, a quiet tragedy repeated again and again in his life. War, plague, and fragile health thinned his family as mercilessly as they thinned the empire. By the late 160s, only one son remained who could realistically inherit power: Commodus. From a legal standpoint, the choice was simple. Roman custom favored biological succession when available. The people expected it. The army preferred it. Stability often followed familiarity. From a philosophical standpoint, the choice was troubling. Marcus knew Commodus. He knew his temperament, his appetite for pleasure, his resistance to discipline. He saw traits that worried him: impulsiveness, vanity, a hunger for admiration without patience for responsibility. And Marcus hesitated. But hesitation does not erase circumstance. By this stage of his reign, Marcus was exhausted. Years of war along the Danube. A plague that hollowed the empire. endless legal work, chronic illness, the death of Lucius Verus, the loss of children. He was aging, and Rome needed certainty. In 166 AD, Marcus named Commodus Caesar, publicly marking him as heir. In 177, he elevated him to co-emperor, making the succession unmistakable. This was not ignorance, it was calculation. Marcus likely believed that early exposure to responsibility might temper Commodus. That shared rule could teach restraint. That proximity to duty might shape character. It was a rational hope. It failed. Ancient sources describe Marcus continuing to instruct Commodus personally, urging moderation, patience, and respect for law. He surrounded him with capable advisors. He delayed full autonomy as long as possible. But character does not yield easily to instruction. Marcus's Stoic outlook complicates how we judge this decision. Stoicism teaches acceptance of what cannot be controlled, and children, ultimately, cannot be controlled. Marcus may have believed that clinging to the adoptive system while ignoring his own son would create instability, resentment, even civil conflict. He may have feared another succession crisis more than an imperfect heir. This is where tragedy enters the story. Not as sudden catastrophe, but as quiet inevitability. Marcus chose continuity over excellence, safety over idealism, peace over risk, and in doing so, he planted the seeds of decline. Later, historians would condemn this choice harshly. Some would argue that Marcus, for all his wisdom, lacked the courage to deny his son power. Others would suggest that exhaustion dulled his judgment. Both may be partly true, but neither captures the full weight of the decision. Marcus was not choosing between good and bad. He was choosing between uncertain futures. One future involved sidelining his own son in favor of a chosen heir, risking rebellion, division, and accusations of hypocrisy. The other involved trusting bloodline and preparation, hoping discipline might grow where instinct had not. Marcus chose hope, Stoic hope, grounded in duty rather than desire. And history would not reward it. Yet there is something deeply human in this choice. The philosopher who taught that we must accept what fate gives us could not fully escape his role as a father. The ruler who believed virtue should guide leadership still lived within the limits of love, fear, and exhaustion. This contradiction does not erase his greatness. It defines it. Because greatness is not perfection. It is responsibility carried to its breaking point. By the time Marcus elevated Commodus fully, the empire was weary. The wars were not over. The frontiers remained unstable. And Marcus himself was nearing the end of his strength. He returned once more to the northern frontier, to the camps along the Danube. There, far from Rome, surrounded by soldiers and uncertainty, the philosopher-emperor would face his final days. And the empire would soon discover the cost of the choice he had made. That ending does not come with drama. It comes quietly. On the edge of the world, he spent his life trying to hold together. Power does not always end in ceremony. Sometimes it fades on the edge of the world it once commanded. In the final years of his life, Marcus Aurelius did not return to Rome to enjoy monuments, speeches, or comfort. He remained where the empire was weakest, along the northern frontier among soldiers, supply lines, and restless borders. The philosopher emperor died far from marble halls, likely in Vindobona, modern Vienna, or possibly Sirmium, deep in the Danubian provinces. Even ancient sources cannot agree precisely on the location. What they agree on is this: Marcus died on campaign. In March of 180 AD, weakened by illness, perhaps the lingering effects of plague, Marcus Aurelius passed away at the age of 58. There was no sudden betrayal, no assassination, no dramatic collapse, just exhaustion. He had ruled for nearly 2 decades under relentless strain: war, disease, economic stress, and political uncertainty. His body had endured as much as his mind. When word of his death reached Rome, the reaction was immediate and reverent. The Senate declared him divine. This was not unusual for emperors, but in Marcus's case, it felt earned. Temples were raised, honors were decreed. His ashes were returned to Rome and placed in Hadrian's mausoleum, joining the line of emperors he had once studied as history. But monuments are never just about memory. They are about narrative. Soon after his death, construction continued on what we now know as the Column of Marcus Aurelius, a towering spiral of carved reliefs depicting his campaigns against northern tribes. It stands today in Rome, echoing the Column of Trajan, telling a story of endurance, command, and divine favor. And yet, the images are strikingly different. Where Trajan's column celebrates confidence and expansion, Marcus's imagery feels heavier. Scenes of hardship, soldiers crossing rivers, appeals to the gods, an emperor present among his men. It is a monument not of conquest, but of survival. This contrast mirrors Marcus's reign itself. He did not expand the empire dramatically. He did not reshape Rome through grand architectural programs. He did not promise eternity. He held the line. And sometimes, that is the harder task. Almost immediately, comparison began. Because Marcus was succeeded not by another adopted philosopher-statesman, but by Commodus, his son, his chosen heir, his greatest gamble. The shift was visible within months. Where Marcus restrained spectacle, Commodus embraced it. Where Marcus sought counsel, Commodus sought applause. Where Marcus endured discomfort, Commodus avoided it. Cassius Dio, who lived through both reigns, wrote that with Marcus's death, Rome passed from a kingdom of gold to one of rust. It is a harsh judgment, but it reflects the shock of contrast. Marcus's memory quickly became a standard by which successors were measured and found lacking. His restraint, patience, and moral seriousness grew larger in retrospect, especially as the empire drifted into instability. Yet, even in death, Marcus left something more enduring than monuments. He left words, not proclamations, not laws carved in stone. Private reflections, never intended for an audience, that survived by chance, copied by monks, rediscovered centuries later. They would outlast columns, outlast temples, outlast empires. Marcus's death marked the symbolic end of the Pax Romana, not because peace vanished overnight, but because the illusion of permanent stability could no longer be sustained. The empire continued, but something essential had changed. A standard had been set and quietly abandoned. And so the question lingers: was Marcus Aurelius the last good emperor? Or was he something more unsettling, a reminder that even the best leadership cannot stop decline, only soften its fall? That question does not belong to history alone. It belongs to us. And that is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable point. Because in the end, the measure of Marcus Aurelius is not found in his victories or even in his failures. It is found in what his life forces us to ask about power, virtue, and responsibility. And that question must be faced directly. So here is the uncomfortable question we avoid, because it unsettles admiration. Was Marcus Aurelius a failure? Not a bad man, not a cruel ruler, but a failure in the one task emperors are ultimately judged by: what follows after them. History prefers clean verdicts. Heroes or villains, builders or destroyers. Marcus fits none of these neatly. He ruled with restraint, discipline, and moral seriousness in an age that rewarded none of those things. And yet, when he died, the empire he held together did not become stronger. It began to fray. Within a few years, the patience he modeled was replaced by spectacle. The legal care he practiced gave way to whim. The restraint he embodied was mocked as weakness. Commodus did not merely rule differently, he ruled in opposition to his father's values. And so the temptation is to say this: Marcus failed because he did not secure the future. But that judgment may misunderstand the nature of failure. Marcus never believed history could be controlled. Stoicism taught him that outcomes belong to nature, not to intention. What belongs to us, what can be judged, is conduct. And by that measure, Marcus did something far more difficult than preserving power. He preserved character. He ruled without pretending to be divine. He endured war without glorifying it. He faced plague without scapegoating. He judged without cruelty. He governed without delight. He accepted authority without loving it. These are not traits that build dynasties. They are traits that preserve humanity inside power. And that may be precisely why Marcus feels unsettling to modern audiences. We want leaders who win. Marcus shows us a leader who endures. We want success stories. Marcus leaves us with moral residue. His meditations do not promise victory. They promise clarity. They do not offer salvation. They offer steadiness. They do not teach how to conquer others. They teach how not to be conquered by fear, anger, or despair. That is not a political program. It is a survival practice. Perhaps Marcus's greatest failure, if we must call it that, was believing that virtue could be taught by example alone. That a son raised near wisdom might absorb it. That institutions could outlast character. History proved otherwise. But perhaps his greatest success was showing that leadership does not have to become monstrous in order to be effective. That power does not have to erase conscience. That even in collapse, one can choose dignity. Marcus Aurelius did not save the Roman Empire. He saved something smaller and rarer. The possibility that a ruler can remain a decent human being while holding absolute power. That possibility still matters, because every age tells itself that cruelty is necessary, that shortcuts are unavoidable, that conscience must yield to survival. Marcus stands quietly across centuries and disagrees. Not loudly, not triumphantly, just persistently. And that is why his words return during pandemics, wars, and moments of moral exhaustion. Not because he offers answers, but because he teaches how to stand when answers fail. If Marcus Aurelius failed, then perhaps failure is not the opposite of greatness. Perhaps it is the price of refusing to become something worse. And that question, whether virtue is worth the cost when the world does not reward it, is not Roman. It is ours. And that is why this story does not end. it waits. And as the night grows quieter, this is where we gently step away. Marcus Aurelius does not leave us with certainty. He leaves us with posture, a way of standing inside uncertainty without hardening, without surrendering, without pretending control where none exists. He ruled the largest empire on earth and still reminded himself that he was temporary, that anger was optional, that dignity could survive even when outcomes did not. Perhaps that is why his voice feels so close when everything feels heavy. If you're still here, thank you for staying with the story if you're listening. As the day fades, or as sleep slowly finds you, let these thoughts settle rather than resolve. They aren't meant to instruct. They're meant to steady. If this reflection stayed with you, you're welcome to leave a quiet thought in the comments about Marcus, about leadership, or about the weight of doing what feels right when it's hardest. And if you'd like to continue wandering through history in this slower, gentler way, you know where to find us. Until next time, rest well and let the past soften the present.